Hello and welcome to the second episode of Conversations of the Kaya. I am Sure,
I am Mohamed.
I'm Sharia.
and today I think you have a very interesting topic. If you're chronically online like myself, you probably see all this talk of data centers. Apparently, people are even thinking of deploying them in space. We're going to see what that looks like. But when you hear this conversation, it's never contextualized to Africa and the implications on our continent. Just to lay the ground on why this conversation is pertinent and the situation Africa is in, I think it makes sense to first of all just start off on the energy side of things, right? Because currently, I think in 2023, Africa produced about 950 terawatt hours of electricity. The same year, if you look at global data center demand, that's about 415 terawatt hours. So almost 45% of, if you're being very honest and realistic with the situation that we have in Africa, we have about, the global data center capacity is taking up about 40 to 45% of what Africa produces. And Africa is not just faced with this, oh, should you adapt data centers or not? We also have an underlying access challenge. You have about 600 million Africans who do not have access to electricity. And given that kind of scenario that we have, it seems like we have a balancing act to do where the rest of the world are focusing on hyperscalers and staying at the cutting edge. For us, we are solving even for the most basic of needs. So the question I have, and I think a good place to start this conversation will be, what's in it for Africa? Like, why exactly, first of all, why, given the huge access gap that we have, what should we even be talking about data centers? Why now? And how exactly does that, how do you contextualize it to Africa, given the current situation we're in, even from an access perspective? I'm really curious what you guys, because I think you work more cuts into this area. I'm curious what your opinion is and how exactly can you bring this data center into Africa in a way that it's not, there's no competing of needs where you are, overlooking other primary needs for the sake of just setting up a hyperscale or setting up, a data center facility to run inference or whatever need that you have.
Yes. So allow me to reintroduce myself. My name is Mohamed. I'm the product and software engineer at Base Consulting, and we deal in the energy space, both from a solution architecturing, providing technical solutions, but also doing research and exploring the gaps that are in the energy sector of Africa. So you have made a good point that there are a lot of Africans, around 600 million households that are not connected to reliable power. But at the same time, we, even Kenya and most countries are already pushing towards building data centers that consume maybe 40 to 50 household, um, the power that could, could be provided to 40 to 50 households. So the question is, why go this approach when you haven't even addressed the basics of providing power to households in the first place? And I think that the reason for this is because of the recent AI trend, and where the world is heading in terms of um, undertaking their white collar jobs. So white collar jobs are mostly work that is done intellectually and that's done through the use of software and computers and maybe papers, like is in most cases with African organizations and African governments. But those are being highly automated with the use of agents, with the use of machine learning, with the use of large language models. And all of these technologies require a lot of power so that they can run on the infrastructure. So a typical application used to require, a typical server used to require around 7 to 15 megawatts. But when you run an LLM, when you run a large language model, you're requiring more than 10 times that capacity. You're requiring 50 megawatts to 100 megawatts. And at the same time, we are in a global economy. We don't just function as Kenya. We don't just function as Uganda. We are interconnected with organizations that are all over the world. And so if these organizations are providing services to Africans, and you're also trying to compete with these organizations to provide the same services, mostly software services, and they're using AI in order to build, in order to do analytics on data, in order to process a lot of these intellectual problems, and you're not, it means you're missing out. And so right now, with the state that we are at is as base, as vast as most of these organizations that are working in the intellectual space, we're using models that are not being run on data centers that are in Africa, but rather in the Americas and in Europe. And it means we are creating economic value for these data centers that are outside of Africa, when you could have done so for our own people and for our own, you know, consumption.
Yeah, I think you make a very valid point. And I think you brought up an issue on data sovereignty. We want our data to stay here. We want, if you're running inference, if I'm chatting with an AI, we want that data to stay on the continent. And the idea is there's a lot of economic value that can be realized from this. It's a very noble perspective, and I think something that I share in. But at the same time, if you look at government, you saw our, I think right now it's in the courts. There was an appeal in the courts, but basically government had entered a deal with the US government, or government, the Kenya government had entered a deal where they're, basically selling away this health data that's been collected over the last decade or so. And so it's hard for me to prioritize data sovereignty when I'm seeing even our governments themselves are not necessarily, very protective of this the goal that is data. And so what's the case to be made for why we need the data centers in Africa? Why can't I run inference in my data center in Europe or in the US? I'm still getting my results. If that's the case, I'm curious what you think of this, Sharia.
Sure. I think just as you put it, you're still getting your results. But what I consider data nowadays is data is like a new currency around the whole world. Like once you have data, or once you have that huge bulk of data or huge source of data, you're able to open up a lot or unlock a lot of opportunities. And you can look at all these companies that have invested in data. Talk about X, talk about Google, talk about Microsoft, all the big five. I mean, all these companies are in the data market, if I can call it that. And what I'm saying, why I'm saying like it would be important for us to embrace sovereignty is that we have now protection on our data itself. Like we ourselves can commercialize this data for ourselves and not build like for other markets, as you said, in Europe and whatever we might be outsourcing this data. Now, to put it in a different perspective, look at the Kenyan grid right now. Like as record peak load that we had last year was around 2,400 megawatts. And a proposal that we have is setting up a 100 megawatt data center in Olkaria. This is a proposal by Microsoft and the G42. And now you'd question like, why do we want also to now inject all this consumption into the grid? Like, why would we want to now destabilize our grid? But the key question remains that would you rather have your data sit somewhere else outside, maybe in Europe, maybe in Americas, maybe in Australia? Would you want your data to sit somewhere outside? Rather than you have control of that data, control over who accesses that data. Yes, we do have contracts with these different companies, but at the end of the day, what runs in the background, you don't have any visibility of that scenario or that setup. So I think for Africa, it's important that we ourselves find ways, and even like I've showed you, like there is a significant gap in growing our power, but what can we do to be able to support that growth and have data for Africa living in Africa?
Yeah.
So I think that's what I can say about it for now.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Because I think the case, is rightfully as you put it, the case has been made. I think I saw some projection. If Africa just captures 10% of the value that's expected to come from AI adoption, that's about 1.5 trillion added to the African GDP, the African economy. So the business case definitely makes sense. But if you were to go back to the data center conversation itself, I don't know if you guys have come across some of these new segments that are being done now, where they'll go to one of these hyperscalers have set up maybe the data center at some place, and then they talk to the local community, and they talk about the water is not the cleanest. There's water, there's air, there's noise pollution also at the same time. So there's there's a cost that comes to having these data centers there. We just talked about one, energy, and I think which is one of the most integral aspects. We have also touched on the second one, which is data, and I think data is what one of the inputs also into the system. So you have energy as an input, we have data as an input, but you also have cooling as a need. And there's a huge concerted effort, I think, to highlight just how water handling, just generally how integral cooling is to the performance and the maintenance of such data centers. So given this trifecta of factors, and we'll also even talk about connectivity, because in Africa it's also a challenge. For you to set up your data center, it means there's good network infrastructure to support the data flow back and forth. And so taking in this thing as holistically, if you look right now in Africa, I think there's about 400 megawatts of installed data center capacity, and that's across the 5 leading markets. So South Africa, Nigeria, Morocco, Egypt, and Kenya. If you look, that total is about 450 megawatts. That's if the total for Africa is less than even what France are doing. France have about 800 megawatts of data center capacity that's strictly going to data centers. And so for us, first of all, there's only been a drop in the ocean as far as adoption on the continent. But adoption or even setting up these data centers here requires a larger conversation, and it's not a strictly a tech conversation, it's not a strictly policy conversation. There's also a need for involvement of local communities. So how do you balance this trifecta of inputs? Because business case has been made. We want to tap into that $1.5 trillion of value to come to Africa. But at the same time, at what cost does it come? And how do we ensure that even as it's coming, there's we don't end up in those kind of scenarios where we see where after a new technology comes or a new way of doing things, people come and take advantage of people in the market. I think you've seen that already happening in AI training, where trainers in Kenya particularly are massively underpaid for work that anywhere else in the world will be paid massively. And so taking that into consideration, having a holistic view on this data center conversation, how do we ensure that one we're participating in this upside, to that economic upside that we know is coming, and we've seen, I think, even proactively in my own life, the way I use AI and the things I've built myself. How do we balance that economic promise while at the same time ensuring that the local community is not left one in terms of energy access, that we don't abandon that conversation and they work in tandem. We're pushing on this technology side, and the access side, we're also making wins. And also, secondly, for the local communities and the areas where we end up setting these centers up, how exactly do we ensure that there's a balance in the sense that we are not disrupting their way of life, whether that's through water access or any of these other ways? And most importantly, and I think as I hand off, most importantly is, how do we muscle up, or how do we drum up the financing, do this undertaking? Because you put the cart before the horse, you're already talking about considerations. But I saw some projections saying right now we have about 400 megawatts of installed data center capacity across Africa. If you tap that to about 1.5 by 2030, I think it was on McKinsey estimation, although McKinsey estimations are as good as ChatGPT. They're saying about, if we are to aim for 1.5, that's tripling what we have currently. That will require about 10 to 20 billion investment. So there's also a need to muscle up investment to support this. So I see it as a very complex conversation, and I'm curious what your thoughts are, because for me, at least when I've been thinking around this, and even in our conversation with the team here and everyone else, there's always that chicken and egg, where it's there's this upside that we really want to participate in, and the place is being made for, but also on this other side, how do you do it in a sustainable way that we're not necessarily doing some of the work that we're doing, or abandoning some of the other more needed work on the continent?
Yeah. Okay. So I want to clarify one thing, and that is, when we put effort into setting up a data center, we're not necessarily taking effort away from building the infrastructure needed to reach for electricity and power to reach the 600 million that are currently unelectrified. And the reason for this is it's not just a power plant that is needed when you want to electrify people. There is the transmission and there's the distribution lines that are needed. So the approach that most organizations are taking that nowadays in order to electrify this 600 million people is by building mini grids. Those small power plants that are catered for this particular community using renewable energies. When you think about these mini grids, they must make financial sense to the project developer. So they must know how they're going to get the initial capex back, and also how they're going to maintain this through operational expenditures and all of that. Like, where do you get the revenue for this?
Yeah.
And you realize that most of these communities are low income communities that will not significantly be able to pay you for that electricity. And so the question will be, how do you finance this such that, and in some cases, you can also generate excess electricity that the community does not need.
Yeah.
And so the question is, how do you bring an off-taker into the picture? And I think that's where the data centers come into the picture. They are a very good off-taker for mini grids that can generate enough capacity to power the community, but also to power these data centers. And that's one case example that Base has done in DRC. So there was a power plant there that was producing enough energy, but there was no one to offtake that energy. And the solution to this was to set up a Bitcoin mining data center at that time. At that time, AI was not trending that much. But Bitcoin mining also requires enough power consumption in order to, do the operation and do the calculation so that it can mine the next chain and the server, the next block. So it's the same approach that we're taking when we want to set up new data centers. So that's one approach, and there are specific companies that will literally pay you in advance so that you can set up this data center, because they know that their demand for data centers and their demand for compute is growing. And by the time you're finished, this is guaranteed that they will take that power off you. And so it's not even a pay or take, it's a pay and take. So you pay whether you take it or not. So that's one thing. Coming down to the cooling conversation now, you mentioned some of this. You could set up the data center, yes. There's enough power, but data centers, 100% of the electricity that's being consumed by these data centers is being converted into heat energy. If you let it sit like that, if you don't bring any cooling into the picture, it means you're going to melt all your equipment, and sooner or later, within a year, like, you have to replenish the equipment. And so that's where the water and resource restrictions come into the picture. So if you're co-located with a community and they have this very thin river or stream of water, and you're using that in order to cool your equipment. And when you cool this equipment, of course, you're letting that water turn into vapor and gets vaporized. It means you're taking away water resources from this community in exchange for giving them some power. And water is needed for survival, whereas power, I would say, is needed, but not so much. And so one solution to that is the advancement in technologies. Instead of using, of course, use liquid cooling. Again, air cooling mechanisms become very ineffective when you reach 30 to 50 megawatts of consumption. Because again, by spinning that fan so much, you're causing a lot of vibration and you're causing a lot of aggregation to the equipment itself. And it just can't spin it fast enough to cool everything. It's like if you had a very hot fan and you're trying to cool it by just waving something.
Yeah.
No matter how much you wave, it's not going to cool as fast as if you just poured water on top of it. And so there are some technologies nowadays that do not necessarily let the water evaporate altogether. It's a complete circular economy where the water is used to cool. The water is then cooled by some technology and the vapor is then cooled by some technology and turned back into water, and that same water comes back. And so you have a limited supply of water. And so you're not affecting the community in any way. One other piece that you could talk about is the electronic waste that these data centers produce.
Yeah.
For a typical AI data center, these equipments go out of commission, or like they just cannot be used by the data center in 1 to 2 years. And so they have to replace the servers, they have to replace the cabling and all of that. So in Africa, we do not produce a lot of these equipments. We always import them. And it doesn't mean that they're 100% ineffective. It means that they could be 50% ineffective. It could be used, it could be replenished and maybe used for lesser workloads.
Inference as opposed to training.
Yes. So I don't necessarily see the electronic waste being generated by this very advanced data centers as a bad thing. It creates a new economy, just like Mitumba or second-hand clothes have created a new economy before. But of course, now that we're catching up and are able to produce our own fabrics, we no longer need them. But at 10 years ago, that was a good economy that benefited the people that were do not have enough money to buy this equipment. So all we can do is, as startups, buy this electronic waste, put it to use for your smaller workloads, and learn from it as much as you can before completely discarding it.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I like your comment on basically the data center playing an anchor load and basically improving the economics of these mid grids. And so it's not necessarily fighting against the energy access goal that you're pushing for. It's actually supporting it the same way as these revenues then go in supporting in extending of these distribution lines. Because I 100% agree the Bitcoin model definitely does work. You've seen even the work we've done in Virunga, in Congo. I think also Gridless Computer very active. Ethiopia taking a lead on that regard. And I see given the rising demand right now around AI, I see most people switching. We were doing mining previously, switching all that capacity back to running inference. Because I think even gamers have been affected by the gold rush has become everyone is running for RAM and GPUs. So on the structuring it as an anchor load, I think that's an absolutely brilliant idea in the sense that it benefits on both. There are benefits on both sides. Cooling, once again, I think is something that has to still be figured out. I think direct to chip cooling is efficient, but efficiency is there's still more work to be done. And I liked where you ended your submission with touching on the point on innovation, because um we so far we've been having a linear conversation in the sense that everyone else is getting data centers. We have all these hyperscalers setting up gigawatts of wanting gigawatts of capacity, tens of gigawatts of capacity for one facility. We're already seeing that happening. But if you to shed all of that, shed whatever is going on for the rest of the world and think of Africa from a first person perspective, given where we are currently, given our competitive advantages, how do we win this race in a very African way? Because if we talk about deploying capital, I think we can clearly see that capital is not a game we can win. You're seeing about 45% of current data center capacities in the US alone. China following closely about 25%. So the concentration of capital means that basically the time between idea or concept to data center is very short, and with that short cycle and constant renewal that's required of this equipment and everything, it's a losing fight if you fight from a purely capitalistic perspective, where the one who deploys capital, the most capital, tends to have the best outcomes. Question I'd like for you, given as you're saying, us leveraging all the equipment and reusing it for, let's say, running inference on all these other things, I think we've already seen that happening. I'm sure you guys are also familiar with edge computing now, where you can run, instead of running a ChatGPT, you can run you can run a Llama on your mobile phone. Could that be a better proposal for Africa, as I said, hey, even as you're tackling this the defender conversation that is very capital intensive, could edge computing offer an opportunity for Africa to leapfrog everyone else, the same way we did with finance? We saw M-Pesa take over in Africa, and we moved cashless faster than other societies that even had more capital, have more deployable capital than us. So is there a similar leverage in one of them, of course, being the small language models? Is that a good enough edge that we can jump on and say, hey, we might not have the most capital to deploy, but guess what? All these millions of Africans who are connected on the internet now via their phones, they never use computers, but they just got introduced to the internet via their phones. Could they also be introduced to AI and interact with AI, the direction where they have vis-a-vis us shooting for having these hyperscalers all over the continent?
Yeah. Okay. So edge computing is a very fun and I think that's how we've been doing technology, like massive compute heavy computations in the past as well, through the use of distributed systems, and that's what the internet is. The data that you see on the internet is not all residing in one place. It's residing across multiple servers. Of course, huge scale servers, but still, it's not in one place. It's distributed, a complete distributed system. So when it comes to AI and LLMs, from the point of creating them, which is acquiring the data, you're not acquiring the data from one central place, you're acquiring it from a lot of people. And so by distributing the process of capturing data, it means you have a lot of valuable data. You'll be able to generate data at at a faster rate. For example, that's what we're trying to do with in the agriculture sector. Equipping everyone with the capacity to collect data, equipping them with sensors to monitor their soil, equipping them with cameras to monitor what do you call it, humidity and anything that a camera will capture. And that way, you have a distributed source of data that you can train your models. Second, when you're training the data, when you're training the models on this data, again, you don't need a huge computer. It will help you, of course, but you can make use of a number of processors that are scattered across the region, across the world. And that's what we call federated learning. It's an active area of research. So it is, how do you securely send data? How do you securely send the process for training this data to Sharia's computer that is capable enough to maybe assist with 1% of the compute and to 99 other computers? And once they've trained it, accumulate all of those weights into one model, and now you have a very resource effective way of having trained this data.
A form of distributed compute.
Distributed compute, distributed storage, distributed input, and also distributed compute. So coming down to now, you've trained it. You want this model to be effective, and you can use the example of a self-driving car. For a self-driving car, you do need the model to be very the latency, the response time for the model to be very fast, right? As fast as it can possibly can, because it is a reactive situation. Like, it is something that is in a live environment, and you can't let it. You can't say, "Oh, the connection went down," or "It's raining," or "We couldn't connect to a server," and so that's why the crash happened. That will not be ever justifiable. And so for them, you also need the model to reside within the equipment itself. And so right now, when, for example, in my field, when we're doing, when I'm using agents in order to help me develop software, I'm always relying on the internet. But if those same models are on my laptop, it means I could develop whatever I need to develop without relying on the internet. And moving into the robotics area as well, when we want robots that can assist in the manufacturing space, in the supply space, all of this need to not rely on the internet and have 8 computing devices, infrastructure built into them, and then the models hosted on them. Securely, of course, because this is, again, intellectual property that belongs to companies. Of course, if they're open source like Asia does it with the Kimi and other models, amazing, like just got it. But if it is a model that someone has put a lot of effort in training and they want to monetize it, you have to make sure that it is securely in this edge compute, and it can generate revenue for the person that has initially developed this model.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I really like the point on distributed compute, because I think that's going to be the in all end all, especially for smaller players within the space. The hyperscalers have monopoly on capital, not monopoly, but borderline monopoly on the ability to basically mobilize capital. I think you saw OpenAI valuing themselves at $1 trillion or so. And so edge computing, I think that's where the real advantage lies, especially competitive edge in the sense that it leverages what you already have to achieve new outcomes that have not been achieved before. And I think I like that approach. I like that as a way to segue into this futuristic approach, because I think I started off the episode by mentioning some of the work people are talking about doing this, data centers in space and all of that. I'm curious, Ishara, where you see the space heading. We've talked about the situation as it is currently, and of course, there's a lot of unpacking that will need to be done further down the road. I think this is one of those topics you just can't kill in one sitting. But I'm curious from where you see things going. I think you've started off on the edge computing side and running models locally, but beyond that, where do you see this playing out? Do you see us also sending rockets to space? I don't.
Okay, for sure, I don't think yet ourselves we're ready to go to space. I mean, we start by, of course, the small steps, improve our grid, leverage our own capital, like you said, branch into like mini grids, investments in mini grids, investments in let's say like even the software that you're using, the hardware that you're using, if you're deploying a cooling system, is this cooling system the state of the art system? And the good thing that we are in right now in this age is that most of this technology has already advanced to that point where we can actually leverage the benefits that were actually like most prevalent that point in the past. And that is, if you look at let's say like cooling systems, most of our data centers that are built, let's say in Kenya, are using like air cooling. So would like to leverage the new technology, use liquid cooling, and even beyond cooling systems. Look at what we've talked about, like small language models. Uh, just a few years back, they could barely do minimum. They did their minimum compute level activity. But right now, they are actually rivaling even the large language models in some cases. So where we are sitting at as Africa is we can adopt this latest bleeding edge technology to be able to serve ourselves and serve ourselves right, or set up ourselves right, rather than we invested like earlier on and then got all these problems and then now have to now rebuild or have to now think about it differently. So in short, the technology is there. All these things have already been built. And what we just need to do is just tap in, source funding by ourselves. How do we do that? Everyone can chip in. You just have to show them the value.
Yeah, that was about value of blockchain, by the way. The proposition was that you could
Crowdsource the money.
funding. Yeah.
We are billions. We are millions of Africans. So we can always contribute to that effort of like improving our economies. And with that, you can look even the example of what Kenya is trying to do with policy and also with setting up like special economic zone like Okaria and Konza. So all this bring in capital within the country. So foreign investors will also come in within the country and will open up this economic zones so people to be able now to get jobs, people to be able to build their own businesses. We have a Vision 2030 target. We'll be able to hit that, of course. But all I'm saying is all this new latest bleeding edge technology, like the latest thinking process has been already employed. So it's for us now to either embrace or sit back and watch the rest of the world moving ahead. So, with what you'd said about moving to space, what I can say about it, of course, it's the most efficient, I think, setup ever because the conditions are favorable. We've talked about cooling, of course, that is like free cooling for you up there. It's a free land,
Infinity. The sun.
infinite energy from the sun. So it's an ambitious effort, but you can see the value in it. And as technology, I think, improves, and as we've seen even with what SpaceX has been able to do with launching different rockets in space and different technologies and different satellites, um, the most important thing I think for Africa will be, hey, do we want to just sit back and relax, or do we want to actually start building?
Yes.
So let's start building and let's start consuming all this technology, the latest trends and everything. We are smart people. We've been plugged into these environments already. So it's a matter of capital, as you said, and you also gave a solution around using blockchain. So why not?
So why if that's the conclusion, then why are we not building a blockchain marketplace or a blockchain crowdfunding platform? Is that Moha? Is that on the list of things we are putting on God or what?
Yes. And so it is definitely in the pipelines to tokenize as many assets as you possibly can, whether that is computer hours, whether that is energy, kilowatt hours, securities in these companies, in the data centers that we will build alongside energy projects that need that offtake.
Yeah.
There's definitely in the base pipeline.
This is the base pipeline. I'm glad. Something Sharia submitted on. I think it's a good point. You can at least wrap up this conversation. was on you use an example of China. I think immediately Trump came into office, he put export controls on chips. So basically Nvidia could not sell like top of the line chips. So I think even there's a time it even applied to H100s, H200s, even the new black hole system. And despite having all these export controls where, the US is saying, hey, we don't want to give China the frontier chips because it's a competition. Even despite that, if you look at the model benchmarks, it's either Chinese model was either leading or just near the lead. We've seen it with DeepSeek happening. We're seeing it right now with Kimi K2, where they might not necessarily have top of the line, or at least as of now, the US is in the lead in terms of hardware. You're still seeing China being able to eke advantages and find out new ways of training models and smart ways of doing things. And I think that's a good way to approach this new technology is work with whatever you have on hand. You have your phone, you have your edge computing device, start from there. So that you're not waiting for this perfect scenario where we've deployed, all this uh, uh, data centers in space and they're making us a ton of money when we sip champagne. We're not there yet, but I guess the future lies on edge. Is it a worthy thing to say that the future of computing in Africa is edge? Or is it a balance of it?
I think it is. It is. I think we have to democratize compute and access to this intelligence for everyone, and across organizations, across individuals. So even if we centralize it at first, they will not always be running centrally. They need to run very close to where they're being utilized. So yeah, it is. Think of it this way. Most of this intelligence are decision makers, and decisions need to be made instantly. Most of them, at least. And it's if you centralize it, you have one central executive office or CEO that is has to communicate to this person, communicate to this person for it to reach the action taker on the ground. With intelligence and with programming intelligence, it means you don't necessarily need one CEO. You can replicate it, copy paste, and give it to everyone so that they can use it.
access. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's where we're going. Even you centralize it now, sooner or later, like the long run, it has to be decentralized. It has to be accessible to everyone. Yeah, on every device.
Awesome. We're decentralizing our money with blockchain, and now we're decentralizing compute with edge computing. Sharia, your parting shots.
So for me, I think I'd say it's a balance.
Yeah.
I'd yes rely on edge computing, but um, I'd still say that we also need to be or feel or act competitively as the outside. So if we also just focus on what is edge computing or what is just the bare minimum that we have, we will never be able to compete at that scale. So I think we also still need to open up our minds in the sense that yes, as Africa, we might be behind, but we can ourselves pull the resources, pull the minds that need to also build all these things and actually do something about it. Like right now, everybody is kind of, and you know the state of the politics around the world right now. Everybody is trying to keep to themselves, protect themselves. So I mean, if Africa can come and pull resources together, it's not something that is out of bounds. I mean, it's within reach, and I think yes, edge computing is a good start, but we also need to still aim for the moon, as you said. And yeah, hopefully we will also launch something and also have a plot in space or somewhere.
Yes, 100%. I think Amos can show us how they did it. They was in jackpot. I think that's a good point to end the episode. I think my key takeaway is that we are looking at 10 to 20 billion that we need to bring in, triple our install data center capacity from 400 megawatts to about 1.5 there. My takeaway is that we're going to be doing that with the blockchain. So looking forward to raising that 20 billion on the blockchain, Mohammed. And then, of course, the other point that I think a good one is having that balance between shooting for the hyperscaler type of model while at the same time leveraging our competitive advantage on device and on edge computing with these small language models. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We'll see you on the next one. I think the data center conversation will need to be revisited a couple of times, and we're looking forward to that. Thank you.